So we're at the point of death. We're in the 11th chapter of Ketubot. The husband has died. The widow is disposing of her husband's assets. And there's a question about the valuation of the assets which she's selling. What if she makes an off-market transaction? And we know that under certain circumstances, she has to get the authority of the court, get the authority of the Bet Din to carry out the transaction, at least according to Rabbi Shimon. But the question then arises, and this is something we've already touched on, what if the court gets it wrong? And that's the point that the Mishnah will reach towards the end of the 11th chapter. Shum hadayanim shepachat shtot or hotir shtot michram batel. If the shum is the valuation, if the valuation of the judges was a sixth less or a sixth more, so it could be either way. And generally, in financial law, in Jewish financial law, once a sale is off market by a sixth, so that'll be nearly 17%. If a sale is off market by a sixth, it can be invalidated. In other words, the buyer can go back to the seller, or the seller can go back to the buyer and say, look, this sale is completely null and void. I'm going to reverse it. I want to reverse it. I demand to reverse it because it's off market. Really interesting difference. This doesn't exist in English or US law. Sale is a sale in English law. But in Jewish law, if it's significantly off market and the quantity is 1/6, so 16.6%, it's considered just null and void. And the Mishnah is saying that even applies to a sale by the court. So the court can have their sale disallowed. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is going to disagree. Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, im kain ma koach bet din. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, look, clearly, well, I put the words in the English side of the source sheet, their sale is valid. These words don't actually appear in the Kaufman edition, but they do in most other printed editions. But that's clearly his sense. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, well, the sale must be valid for, if that's the case, if the sale can be nullified, of what use is the power of the court? So he seems to think that the power of the court, the power of the court essentially overrides any questions of off market. And the Mishnah concludes, the Mishnah concludes that if they made a public announcement, Ela im asu igeret bikoret. So they've made a public announcement, and for a land transaction, they have to do this. So the Gemara makes clear for a land transaction, they need to make a public announcement. Ela im asu igeret bikoret. If they made a public announcement, afilu machru shoveh maneh v'matayim, or shoveh matayim b'maneh michran kayam. If they made a public announcement, their sale is valid. Michran kayam. Even if they sold for 200 zuz, what was worth one maneh, in other words, 100. Or even if they sold for one maneh, what was worth 200 zuz. So in other words, it seems that if you make a public announcement, you're completely in the clear as the Bet Din. And that effectively, that is the effective conclusion of this 11th chapter of Ketubot, which is really all about valuation and about rights to dispose of property. And yet, funnily enough, even though this is the logical conclusion of the chapter, there is one further Mishnah. There's one further Mishnah which deals with an edge case of someone who is not entitled to a ketubah at all. So we're no longer with the widow. It's not clear why this Mishnah is sort of tacked on to the end of our chapter. And it's not connected to the chapter that follows. It's not connected to the material that comes before. It's going to mirror, in fact, a principle that we've learned in Yevamot, and we'll have a look at that in a sec. But the Mishnah says, Hayitzuma, this is an orphan. Hayitzuma hamu'amenet. And I've got hamu'amenet in brackets here because it's a correction which is written in the margin of the Kaufman manuscript. So if you like, if you take the manuscript as a whole, it has Hayitzuma hamu'amenet, an orphan who refused. Now, an orphan, that is someone whose father is no longer alive, can be married off by her brothers and her mother. But that marriage is not, we've learned this before, that marriage isn't considered to have full legal full, if you like, halachic validity. It's not considered deraita. It's a rabbinic marriage. I mean, this distinction is a little bit abstruse because all marriages are actually rabbinic. But the halacha is that an adult woman can agree to be married. A child can be married by her father, but not by anybody else, not by her mother and her brothers. So if she's an orphan, if her father's dead, well, she can't be married. And of course, that creates other problems. So the rabbis have ordained that her brothers and her mother can marry her off. But in that case, she has the right to refuse. So we're talking now about an orphan who was married off, but who refused. So the marriage effectively never took place. The marriage was annulled. This is not a marriage. This is really important. Yutuma ha'ma'amenet, an orphan who refused. The shniya. A shniya is a secondary prohibition. We've learned the list of the secondary prohibitions in Yevamot, actually. We can just have a quick, we should be able to have a look at them. It's actually a Gemara in Yevamot, but we learned it when we looked at Yevamot. Our teachers taught Tanu Rabbanan Ma'hein Hashniyot. What are the secondary relationships? These are all forbidden relationships. His mother's mother, his father's mother, his father's father's wife, his mother's father's wife, the wife of his father's maternal half brother, and so on and so on. These are all basically incestuous relationships, but they're not actually spelled out in the Psukim. So the Gemara calls them secondary relationships. They're, if you like, secondary prohibited relationships. And the rabbis are really anxious about, the rabbis are actually more anxious about these relationships than they are about relationships which are forbidden in Torah. Because if the relationship is forbidden in Torah, the rabbis seem to assume everyone will take care of it. But the shniyot, these are edge cases. Maybe people won't take care. So let's keep that in mind. So we've got the orphan who refused, the shniya, someone who married in breach of a secondary relationship. Ve'ha'ailonit. An ailonit is someone who is congenitally unable to bear children. This is not someone who has kind of problems conceiving. This is someone, for example, who has no womb. Someone who can never conceive. She can never conceive. She's congenitally unable to conceive. And again, a marriage to an ayori is not considered a marriage. I suppose it could be considered a mekach ta'ut, a sort of a transaction taken in error. Maybe that is the connection with the previous Mishnah, which talks about off-market transactions. So the valuation of the judge being 1/6 less or 1/6 more is an off-market transaction. It's just null and void. So maybe that is the connection with this final Mishnah, that this marriage to someone who can't have children is considered just not a marriage. Just as the orphan who refuses is not a marriage, and the shniyah, well, that is, okay, the rabbis forbid it. And we'll see that in all three of these cases, the rabbis actually, they treat the marriage as not having taken place, and the wife doesn't receive any financial benefit at all. As if, doesn't receive any financial benefit at all. So the Mishnah goes on to say, Ein la ketubah, she gets no ketubah when she separates. Velo perot, she doesn't get any income from the dowry she brought in. Velo muzanot, she doesn't get any maintenance. Velo vlaot, she doesn't get the worn out clothes. As part of her maintenance, she's entitled to clothes. She's also entitled to keep the clothes when they're worn out. None of these financial benefits accrue in these cases. I think the first and the last, because we're considering that the marriage never really took place, and the second, the middle case, ashniya, essentially the breach of secondary prohibitions, is because the rabbis are very anxious about that, and they essentially come down very hard on a woman who allows herself to get into that kind of relationship. Just as they come down hard, and we learned this in Yevamot, they come down incredibly hard on a woman who allows herself to get married to two men. Now, what if the marriage was on the understanding that she couldn't have children? That's different. So that's not a mekach ta'ut. That's not it's not a transaction. It's not a transaction in error. It's with knowledge. If from the outset he took her as an Ilonit, he married her on the basis that she couldn't have children, yesh la ketubah. In that case, she has a ketubah. That's just like a normal marriage. But the normal classic prohibitions, almana lechohen gadol, a widow married to a high priest, it's a forbidden marriage, grusha v'chalutza lechohen ediot, a divorced woman or a chalutza married to a regular priest, mamzeret unitina l'Yisrael, a mamzeret or a nitina married to an Israelite, or the other way round, but Yisrael a mamzeret natina, a Jewish girl married to a mamzer or a natin, yesh la ketubah. Somehow, even though these prohibitions are more severe, the rabbis do not punish the woman who gets involved in one of these marriages in the same way that they punish someone who is in breach of one of the secondary prohibitions.